Welcome back. So we got the new Arcane weapon, and it's the red tome this time around from Arcane Ophelia. And I pretty much got my entire video wrong on the predicting Arcane thing, so yeah, oh well. It's a new red tome that we got, meaning that a lot more red tomes are readily viable now, which is really, really great. However, there is one caveat with the tome, and that is that it's just extremely limited in scope and what it can accomplish, which is perfectly fine if that's what you're looking for specifically. But I find that this video might be a bit on the shorter end, mainly because, again, there's just not much on the weapon itself. But nevertheless, people are going to be pulling for it, so I want to give a guide on it before people decide to pull the trigger. So, we may as well just get started with the weapon itself. Arcane Eclipse is a slaying weapon as per usual. It has a quick impulse effect with a guaranteed follow-up, spectrum stats, and attack penalty neutralization, meaning that you can always consistently get attack out at the bare minimum your base amount, which will be really, really nice just for general damage output, which makes sense because she also comes with finish and spiral and all that stuff. But outside of just pure damage output, the fact that it is a slaying tome means that you can afford to run area of effect specials, and it does make it a lot easier because it does have a quick impulse effect. And this is probably what you're going to be doing for the most part with the new Arcane Eclipse. Still, even beyond that, it also grants a guaranteed follow-up, meaning that it's going to work on a lot more units than the Arcane Axe would have, as having a guaranteed follow-up means you don't necessarily have to rely on stuff like Quick Riposte. And since Quick Riposte 4 is going to be really, really expensive, it's not realistic to expect every single slow unit to have Quick Riposte 4 on them. Sure, there are probably units that have it, but for the most part, it's really just going to boil down to either fighter skills or Quick Riposte 3. And the fact that it has a guaranteed follow-up does make it a lot more flexible in that regard. Still, in terms of overall flexibility, there really isn't much to it. That being said, there are things we can try and do with it. And before we do get into the builds, I do want to mention that Ewan is due for a refine sooner or later. It could literally be any time between next month and maybe like 6 months down the road, or maybe even earlier. I don't really know the exact scheduling, but he's a book 3 red tome, so you could easily just wait on giving him the Arcane, unless you're really impatient. But there's a good chance that his weapon may just end up being a lot better in the long term, but you never know really. Still, we might as well get right into the builds, starting with the general infantry sets. As I mentioned, this weapon definitely heavily favors AoE sets because it's just really, really easy to charge and loop. And AoEs in general are going to be really, really strong against a majority of tanks, especially against save armors. Save armors that have AoE protection like Kanagis and Nagi are going to be a bit more troubling, but for the majority of the other ones, it should still do quite a decent chunk. So, if you wanted to focus on speed-based area of effects specials, you could always go with Double Life and Death, and then run the same old Special Spiral and Times Pulse. You will have to run any sort of outside support to get the 4th charge, because Arcane Eclipse only accounts for 2, and then Times Pulse only gives the 3rd one. So if you're running any sort of Infantry Pulse, or Grand Scratcher, or even Groom Raphael or New Year Valoria support, that will allow you to get the AoE immediately, which will be really, really convenient. You could also use it on any sort of red mage with decent res, as there are units that can reduce AoE's effectiveness with Dragon Wall, for example. And personally, I think Salem might honestly be one of the better candidates when it comes to the Arcane Eclipse, at least when it comes to a AoE set, because he has high speed and he has high res. That being said though, he doesn't have nearly as much attack as Peleus, but it's really just going to come down to an opportunity cost, as you can either cover for both speed and res, or you could cover for just more damage output. But regardless of which one you go down, you basically just want to grab any red mage with a good attack stat, because that's really the whole point of an AoE to begin with. You could also try some gimmicky stuff like a Miracle set. Arcane Eclipse puts Miracle at a 4 cooldown special. With the initial Quick Impulse, it comes to 3, Times Pulse and Quick Impulse makes it 1, and if you were to use Flashing Blade, even if there are guard effects present, you'll be able to charge Miracle on the first hit. Meaning that if you simply want a really safe initiation, you could do that with the likes of anybody really. Preferably if you were to put this on somebody faster, it would be a lot more beneficial because you would be able to prevent any sort of natural doubles, and the only way you'd really be able to double a unit this way is through Brave, which isn't nearly as common as just having a guaranteed follow-up. Still, this could potentially work. I'm not going to say whether or not it's a very good idea. However, if you are looking for something just for a really safe initiation, I think it does have its merits. And then outside of that, you can pretty much just do any sort of damage dealing set. Arcane Eclipse with Ruptured Sky and Special Spiral means that you can always have your special ready. unless you get pulse tide, but even then, as long as you're able to trigger a special during combat, you'll just get it back afterward. And with Special Spiral 4 reducing any sort of damage reduction effects, it means that your damage output's going to be really consistent. And the only way you're really going to be able to tank this is with the likes of Hardy Bearing. And you may be wondering why you want to run a 2 cooldown special with a Slaying Tome and Special Spiral 4. And my answer is really just going to boil down to an instant damaging special. And while you could always replace it with maybe something like Luna or any other 3 cooldown special, you will need an external charge if you want to get the special immediately ready, unless you would rather just allow the Hardy unit to soak the first hit and then you get the special on the second hit, which is also perfectly viable. But I find that maybe getting an instant special could be beneficial. However, it will ultimately depend on the types of matchups you really go up against. Outside of general infantry units, you could just put this on any fast unit with Water Sweep or Wind Sweep. If you have a unit that can stack more defense than res, then you're better off just running something like Water Sweep so you can cover dragons who have adaptive damage. So with Tharja, for example, she may not have the highest defense. I just picked her out of like any random one because she's fast. But with Sturdy Impact, Arcane, and Bonus Doubler, she should be able to stack up her defense quite well enough to the point where she could at least eat a single physical hit. And then with Water Sweep, you won't really have to worry about mages or dragons targeting her res, which would be really nice. And for the units that don't really have a high defense stat and a high res stat, you could just go with Wind Sweep and the Mystic Boost seal. It will come at the cost of a bit more stats, but Mystic Boost 3 will be very beneficial for shutting off any sort of dragon. If you already have high res, mages aren't really going to touch you as much, but dragons can still mess you up if they have the adaptive damage ready to go. So having Mystic Boost in your kit will definitely be very beneficial. And as long as you're able to speed stack enough, then Wind Sweep will just be able to cover a lot of the melee threats or any threat that targets her defense. Beyond that, you can really put this on any slow cavalry unit. I find that Dancer Sigurd's probably going to be one of the better options for this because he can act as a really decent support unit with Infantry Speed Tactic, Sabotage Attacks, Stillwater, Fury 3, and Arcane Eclipse with a 2 cooldown special, so that way he could also soak Pulse Ties, which would be really good if you are banking on a unit that has an instant special and you need that instant special. For Sigurd in particular, this will make it a lot easier, especially since you don't need to give him external support for the additional cooldown. And then you could always give it to Leo. Leo really isn't the best unit, and even with Arcane, it may not really do too much, but he does have okay mixed bulk, so with Arcane, Defense Risk Solo, and Mystic Boost 4, you should be able to take a fair amount of hits when needed, although blues will still probably mess him up for days. But with the debuff that you get from Mystic Boost, the additional debuff that you can apply from Attack Smoke, Defense Risk Catch, and all the other stuff, you should be able to stack his bulk quite high, but he will definitely be relying on Iceberg procs. And finally, we have the armors, who are definitely going to benefit the most from this, as per usual. Because it has a guaranteed follow-up and slaying, you could do a variety of stuff with the weapon. So for example, if you wanted to run Special Fighter with the Arcane, you still get the double as long as the foe doesn't have any no follow-up or impact effect. And with Special Fighter, you'll always be able to retaliate with an Iceberg. And if you are able to double, you get to retaliate with 2 Icebergs, which is really nice. Of course, if you are worried about any sort of impact effect, you could still run a double fighter set, which may not necessarily be the worst idea, especially since you could get an additional effect from it. Just keep in mind that Arcane Eclipse does neutralize any attack penalties, which still doesn't cover your defense and res, so you can still keep Slick, but there is a bit of overlap there. But with Crafty Fighter and Arcane, or any other fighter skill that grants a guaranteed follow-up in the enemy phase, you are able to bypass any sort of impact negation, which will be really convenient. Or if you want to do something that's a bit old school, you could try the old Hector set, which was Wary Fighter with Quick Riposte. And the idea here, which was all the way back in 2018, was that because Hector had a guaranteed follow-up in our mods, he could run the Quick Riposte seal and Wary Fighter, and he basically had an Omni Breaker. And you could basically do the same thing here with Arcane and Wary Fighter and Quick Riposte 3. Just keep in mind that it may not necessarily be the most effective if the foe has any sort of guaranteed follow-up with a good amount of speed, or they have no follow-up. But if you are able to just eat 1 hit, that's not bad whatsoever. Of course, you could also try and remedy their mixed bulk by giving them Quick Riposte 4 and Deflect Missile. I think they'll be fine enough to take a hit on the res side, but on the defense side, it may be a different story. So with Quick Riposte 4 and Deflect Missile, you could also bypass any sort of brave attacks, if there are any, which will be convenient, especially for just general tanking. And with Quick Riposte 4 granting 25% damage reduction, with Deflect Missile then going into a flat 80%. That's really decent for tanking. And then Quick Riposte also grants a guaranteed follow-up with a 25% threshold, so you also get the impact negation from it too, which is quite nice. So you can actually run Glacies, and you can trigger it as long as you're able to double and the foe's able to double. And outside of that, I guess you could try something with Special Spiral 4 if you want to do more than just tank. I don't necessarily think it's the best idea, but you do have a guaranteed follow-up from the Arcane, so it is a bit more flexible in that regard. So if you do want to prioritize both tanking and damage output, Special Spiral 4 may not necessarily be the worst idea. And it's funny that only armors and infantry can get it, because this would have helped so many Cavs and Flyers too. But as far as builds go, this is really about it. There really isn't much else to the weapon because it's very, very limited in scope. And if you're wondering about whether or not you should give it to a specific unit, I do have a list of units that you should give it to if you are looking to give it to somebody. Units that could go either way with it, and units that you definitely just want to keep their PRF. So for the replace weapon, it's definitely going to be a lot of the old Gen 1 units that don't really have a good PRF or Inheritable to boot. Or you have some instances where even newer units have a PRF, but it's not really going to be as good as the Arcane. So for example, you could give this to Azel or Hilda, and you'll probably get a lot more mileage out of that than whatever they already come with. Again, you could give it to any sort of Gen 1 or Gen 2 unit. Even Leon, who has a Raven Quick Riposte tome, he could use this and it's just going to be a lot better. Ewan, who is due for a refine pretty soon, if you don't want to wait, he can still make quite a decent user of it. And really, that's going to be about it in terms of just the replace weapon category. The units that could go either way is a bit more interesting because you can either replace their niche for something that makes them a bit more competitive, or you could try something that's a bit more gimmicky. So, for example, you could always give this to Legendary Lilina, and while you won't be able to use Gifted Magic, you can still use this with a Valoria, and you should be able to get a Blazing set ready to go. And this could be really, really good for stuff like Summoner Duels. I use a Blazing special over her innate Gifted Magic because it just hits a lot harder. So with the Arcane, you could also at least double in combat, and assuming that the foe isn't able to retaliate and one-shot her, she'll get more damage out. You also have stuff like Hugh, who has a decent weapon for what it's worth. It's a lot of stats, but it doesn't really have any other effects besides that. So if you want something that has a guaranteed follow-up with Slaying, which will actually benefit him quite well because he has one of the best offensive stat lines for a red mage, then it's definitely worth replacing over his innate tome, but it's not necessary at the end of the day. Same thing with Julia. Even though this weapon is an upgrade, you do lose out on Light and Dark, which honestly may come in handy at times, but if you would rather just give her no follow-up with Wind Sweep or Water Sweep, then that will probably be a lot better in the long term, especially since you don't have to rely on a solo condition for the guaranteed follow-up. And then there's other miscellaneous candidates who can pretty much use the tome too, and they'd basically be replicating a lot of the generic stuff, but they might have a lot more effectiveness if they can't reliably get their own weapon going. And for the don't replace category, it's basically all the super really good units or units that have just a way better weapon. So Halloween Noe, who has her teleportation gimmick, which may not necessarily be great for combat, but she's a really decent support unit. Julius with his Dragon Wall. Kanas, who hits absurdly hard with his tome. Tana, who's also a mix of support and combat. Garneth, well, not necessarily the most amazing unit, does have his Fire Sweep tome, which can be really, really convenient. Huber, who just got a refine, which I would argue is really good for supportive purposes. Ishtar doesn't really matter. Her combat's really not that great anyway, but if you had to go into combat with her, I would rather take the Brave tome. Violet, who has no follow-up. Lysithea, whose tome is just objectively better. Plumeria's PRF Dance. Lith, who would only really want to keep his weapon because it has damage reduction, which sounds stupid when I say it, but it does reduce damage reduction effects, which is really convenient. Camilla, Dual Phase Brave. Veronica, Fire Sweep, Desperation, Slaying, Enclosure, you name it. Constance, I also believe, has no follow-up. Layla, you could potentially do it, but I don't think her combat's really that great regardless of what weapon you give her, so you may as well just keep her niche. And then Ophelia, who comes with the weapon, and it's just better than any other Inheritable red tome that we have currently. And that's really going to be it in terms of the Inheritance Guide. If you do plan to pull for this weapon, let me know who you're going to give it to, because I am curious, and I want to know if you do plan to give it to anybody specifically, what kind of set are you going to run on them? This has been the guide video for the Arcane Red Tome. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.